And at one of his last meetings, President Bush told his appointees, he said, history is not short term. History is long term. You can't just put history on a sticky note like the media sometimes wants to do and move on. It's a long-term look. What I think is fascinating about that is John Adams, one of his best assessments of the American Revolution, didn't come in 1776 or 1783 when the peace treaty was signed. It came 40 years after the end of the American Revolution. This is what John Adams wrote to a friend. He said, "What do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the war?" He said, "The revolution was a change in the hearts and minds of the people. It was a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." And how often is the revolution just tossed off to being a war with England? It was so much more than that. It was a change in their thinking. And as I researched and read through the documents and papers of our founders to write this book, I thought about, well, when did the revolution begin for George Washington? If it wasn't just a war, when did it begin for him? When did it begin for John Adams? And I think today, as we think about imparting our heritage onto the next generation, to our children and grandchildren, we need to think about our founders as real people and ask some of those questions of them. You know, we ask our kids, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, that's a question maybe phrased a little differently that we can ask about George Washington. What did he dream of doing? And one of the dreams that he had was to be a soldier. And I think that's when the revolution began for him. When he was 22 years old, George Washington was a colonel. He was proud to serve his king. In 1755, he went up to the Ohio River Valley and fought a terrible battle against the French and Indians on behalf of the British. The battle went terribly wrong. George Washington was one of the last to leave the battlefield. And when he got to the comfort and retreat of Fort Cumberland, Maryland, he heard this terrible rumor that he had died, and even what his final words were. I mean, they were surprised when he walked in to Fort Cumberland, Maryland, because they thought he was a goner. Now, what would you do if you heard that rumor, that had gone ahead of you and was traveling down the Potomac? Well, on 9/11, when I was evacuated from the White House on September 11th, 2001, I immediately emailed my father, "I'm okay." That's what George Washington did. Not an email, of course, but he wrote a letter to his mother and his brother. And he said, "I take this early opportunity of contradicting both," referring to his death and final words. "And I want to assure you that I appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence, which protected me beyond all human expectation." He went on to say that he had taken off his coat, and there were 4 bullet holes in that coat, but he was unhurt. 2 horses were shot out from under him, yet he was unscathed, he was unharmed. And he had to think in that moment, why was my life preserved? What is my purpose in life? He had to think about that. In that same letter, he wrote to his mother and brother, he said, they panicked. The British soldiers panicked. And because the British redcoats had come over from England and they had joined up with this Virginia regiment and they had fought side by side, but the redcoats abandoned the Virginia regiment, and that made George Washington mad. He was angry. He was like, "Why don't we all serve the same king? I mean, I'm not a Yankee Doodle wearing a macaroni hat or what, that's what the British redcoats thought back then of their American counterparts." Now, I don't think George Washington the next day was ready to go take up arms and fight against the King of England. But I think that moment made him think, something's not right here. And I think the seed of revolution could have very well been implanted in his mind back then, that change of thinking, that something's not quite right here with England. And as time grew on, I think that seed grew, and it gave him the courage to take up the command of Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775.